Hello, and welcome to People of the Pod, brought to you by American Jewish Committee. Each week, we take you beyond the headlines to help you understand what they all mean for America, Israel, and the Jewish people. I'm your host, Manya Brashear-Pashman. Since October 8th, Iran's terror proxy Hezbollah has escalated its attacks on Israel, launching rockets, drones, mortar shells toward Israeli civilians on a near-daily basis. More than 10,000 to date, pushing thousands of residents from their homes in Israel's north. More than 11 months later, on September 27th, Israel Defense Forces launched a massive retaliatory airstrike targeting Hezbollah's headquarters in Lebanon, killing the group's founder and leader, Hassan Nasrallah, and other senior officials. Here to talk about how significant this development might be for Israel and its neighbors is Dr. Matthew Levitt, director of the Reinhard Program on Counterterrorism and Intelligence at the Washington Institute. Matt, welcome to People of the Pod. I'm going to launch right into questions. Has Hezbollah been significantly disabled by Israel's attack, or is Nasrallah's death just a setback for the terrorist group?
This is extremely consequential, and it's not just this one attack. So we're talking about 2 weeks of activities that come straight out of Hollywood. Hollywood would have rejected the script for being too fanciful. First, the pagers exploding, 24 hours, then the walkie-talkies exploding. This already coming on the heels of almost 500 Hezbollah operatives, some of them quite senior, being eliminated. So you already had the beginning of the kind of hierarchy of Hezbollah leadership being taken out. And now what you have is Fuad Shukr, Ibrahim Akil, members of the Jihad Council, the High Military Council for Hezbollah being taken out. And then, of course, on Friday, taking out the Hezbollah Operational Command Center, which itself is extremely important. And in that operation, killing both Hassan Nasrallah and another member of the Jihad Council, Ali Karaki, and a senior Quds Force general. So it's not one thing. It's the totality of all these things, and they haven't stopped. Seen over the weekend into Monday, more Israeli airstrikes where they are clearly taking out as much of the Hezbollah medium and long-range rocket systems as possible. Those are the systems that present the greatest threat to Israel. And there are even reports coming out today that Israeli special forces units have been sneaking across the border to take out tunnels and other things. All of which is to say, A, the Hezbollah that existed just a few days ago no longer exists. Hezbollah's there, but it will take a very long time and a whole lot of support for it to reconstitute itself. And when this part of the war is done, and it's not done yet, clearly the next phase is going to be preventing Iran from resupplying. And so already an Iranian plane tried to land in Beirut. The Israelis told the Lebanese government, it lands, we shoot it. It didn't land. The Israelis targeted some type of smuggling operation all the way out on the Syrian-Iraqi border over the weekend, clearly smuggling. The Hezbollah that exists today is nowhere near as capable of fighting a prolonged full-scale war as Hezbollah was, say, 10 days ago.
And what does that mean for Iran in the region?
Look, Hezbollah was first among equals within Iran's proxy network, what it likes to call its axis of resistance. And so it's not just effectively having lost Hamas as a fighting force in Gaza. And it's not even just losing another proxy. It's the pearl in Iran's proxy network. You know, we just published a new version of my book on Hezbollah with a new chapter that focuses on Hezbollah's role helping other Shia militant groups in the region make themselves more capable on behalf of this Iranian proxy network. Hezbollah is no longer available to do that. And it really picked up the pace of that activity on behalf of other Shia militia groups in the region after the death of Qasem Soleimani. So this is something more than just another militant group. And Iran for itself, you might think because Hezbollah is so important to them, the Iranians would attack Israel. The Iranians are being very, very careful. They kind of got the message, right? If you attack Israel, Israel's going to hit back really, really hard. They understand that unlike in April, where they shot some 300 projectiles at Israel, basically all of which missed, and then Israel had this very, very specific, limited attack back, shooting a small number of projectiles, all of which hit and took out air defense systems near Natanz, one of the key nuclear facilities. The Iranians understand that this time around, the Israeli response would be very, very different. And no one can say after the April response, well, maybe they can't go the distance. Maybe they can't get past the air defense systems. And if anybody had any questions, even just over this weekend, the Israelis responded to Houthi attacks from Yemen with a very, very long range attack, just about the same distance or near the same distance they'd have to go to hit some things in eastern Iraq and in Iran.
And speaking of Iran, nuclear negotiations, where do those stand now, if there are any, still underway? And how does this affect that?
It's very connected, even though the nuclear negotiations are effectively nowhere. Now, there's a new Iranian president who is very focused on trying to roll back sanctions. He is, in fact, a moderate when it comes to some domestic policy. He is not a moderate when it comes to does he support Hezbollah, etc. He's part of the system, and the system is very much one of what they would call resistance. And so while he came to the UN General Assembly last week and had a much more kind of calm, moderate, sort of pragmatic message about diplomacy, as he was saying those words, Iran was doing all kinds of other things in the region to support Hezbollah. And more significantly, for this issue, the nuclear issue, Iran has significantly ratcheted up its nuclear program activity over the past 11 months. Authorities are concerned that we're maybe potentially, weeks away from breakout should Iran make that decision, which it has not yet done, but that's right on the cusp. And so this really does affect the calculations with Hezbollah, even before the Israeli actions to degrade Hezbollah's military capabilities. But certainly now, as Iran is trying to decide if it should conduct a retaliation of its own, because for Iran, there's really only one red line. It doesn't want whatever regional war it kicks off to cross into Iran, and it wants the powder dry on most of Hezbollah's rockets because it sees those rockets as the best deterrent against an Israeli or anyone else's attack on Iran's nuclear program, or if someone should attack the nuclear program, the best second strike capability. So it's not that the Iranians have become Zionists, nor have they backed off of their really serious desire to have Hezbollah take the fight to Israel. Just right now, there's a competing interest in their nuclear program, which is a much bigger strategic consideration. And so they actually want most of the powder dry, as much of that powder is left after the Israeli airstrikes, to defend against, to deter against an attack on their nuclear program.
I want to widen the lens to regional stability, not just Iran or Lebanon or Israel. Some people have actually said September 27th was just as monumental for the Middle East as the Abraham Accords. Is that a bit of a stretch, or do you agree?
Look, it's premature to say exactly what September 27th will be, but it's something big. It's too early to tell the specific trajectory, but this is a watershed moment without question. I see the potential for very good things to come out of this. I see the potential for Lebanon to finally be able to declare sovereignty over its own country. Hezbollah, which is an unelected entity, the only sectarian militia to hold on to its weapons after the Taif Accords that ended the civil war, has effectively been making decisions of life and death, war and peace for all Lebanese without their say-so. Many, many Lebanese, the overwhelming majority of Lebanese, don't want a war and are going to be angry at Hezbollah for a war of choice that they jumped into on October 8th that may have dragged Lebanon into this war. I see an opportunity for a significant setback, if not broader dismantling, of Iran's proxy network. Hamas in Gaza is not what it once was, period. It still exists. It can still do things in Gaza and the West Bank. It has leadership in Lebanon and Turkey and Qatar, but it is not what it once was. And the Israelis have demonstrated by killing Ismail Haniyeh in Iran when he was there for the president's inauguration in an IRGC safe house that they will take the fight where they need to eliminate arch terrorists behind things like October 7th. You saw over the weekend Hezbollah getting hit really, really hard again and again and again. This is not a one-off like the assassination of Abbas Musawi, the original Secretary General of Hezbollah in 1992. You saw this weekend after the Houthis attacked Israel again, and the Israelis went in hard and hit Houthi infrastructure in Yemen. And so the next stage of this has to be doing much more to disrupt Iran's ability to send weapons and to send money to its proxies. Without those weapons, without that money, the Houthis, frankly, are an annoying prick in the Saudi backside. Without that funding, Hezbollah is nowhere near what it became over the past few decades. And the same goes for the rest of the Iranian proxies.
How does this affect the conflict in Gaza with Hamas?
Nasrallah hitched his wagon to Hamas by announcing that he would continue targeting Israel with near daily rocket attacks so long as there was not a ceasefire. That gave Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar in Gaza even more leverage. And while it's true that Prime Minister Netanyahu was sometimes playing hardball over control of the Philadelphia corridor, etc., U.S. officials that I've spoken to who've been involved in this process say that the reason there hasn't been a ceasefire deal over the past few weeks is entirely Hamas's fault, because Hamas moved the goalposts on which specific Hamas leaders in prison were to be released in the first round, wanting the worst of the worst now, probably thinking there wouldn't be a second round. And there's no way the Israelis were going to be able to do that. One thing that this does is it demonstrates to Hamas just how serious Israel is. I mean, Hamas is far less dangerous than Hezbollah. And if Israel's willing to do all of this against Hezbollah, Hamas has to understand, like, this is not ending anytime soon. There's also talk about whether or not the Iranians turn to Hamas at some point and try and find a face-saving way for Hamas to say, okay, we'll take a ceasefire, because that would provide Hezbollah a face-saving way to say, okay, now we're going to stop the rockets, which maybe would end the Israeli onslaught targeting Hezbollah. I think that that is not a likely scenario, but it is a real scenario. Iran is not going to sacrifice Hezbollah, its crown jewel in its proxy network, for Hamas. So there's lots of ways this goes, but it ultimately doesn't change the fact that Hamas is still holding hostages, that the time is running out for these hostages, as painful as it is to articulate that, and that Israel is still fighting on multiple fronts.
How should the U.S. respond, or should the U.S. even participate in this?
The U.S. should not participate in this, and the Israelis will not ask the United States to participate in this. They never have. The United States, the administration has come out with very clear messages saying that Israel has a right to defend itself, and understanding that this is in response to 11 and a half months of near daily shelling. This is not an Israeli escalation. It is a long, long delayed Israeli response. They understand that the Israeli War Cabinet, before this all started, before the pages went off, they expanded the war goals, not to include the destruction of Hezbollah, not even to include a goal of destroying as many of Hezbollah's missiles as possible. The war goal is very clear: to enable the 60,000 plus Israelis displaced from their homes to be able to go home after 11 and a half months. And to do that, they have to deal with the rocket threat, and they have to deal with the threat of a cross-border October 7th style invasion by Hezbollah, of the type, by the way, that Hezbollah was apparently plotting when Israel took out Ibrahim Akil and a bunch of other Red One Special Forces commanders last week. And so I think the administration understands that. The administration also just concluded a very significant arms deal with Israel that will provide Israel the weaponry it needs to defend itself. And the United States has also sent naval assets in particular to the region as a signal to Iran in particular: don't get involved. And I think that has been a message that the Iranians have also heard.
Just as in the Gaza conflict, there have been calls for an immediate ceasefire in Lebanon because of the level of civilian casualties and the possibility of escalating violence. Matt, what's your take?
Two things can be true. There is more work to be done, and this is having devastating consequences. As we saw in Gaza, we are seeing in Lebanon the consequence: a militant terrorist group establishing military infrastructure behind and under civilian infrastructure and hiding behind human shields. And there's only so much warning you can do. And the Israelis have sent warnings: get out of Dahya. They sent warnings on cell phones in Lebanon. You know, if there are rockets near in your house, get out. There's only so much you can do. The Israelis are doing now, in a matter of days, is dismantling more of the Hezbollah military infrastructure and firepower that has been built up over decades now than they have over many, 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 many years. And so there'll be calls in Israel to continue to push to not mitigate or even degrade, but to destroy as much of the military threat that Hezbollah has been posing as possible. There will also be calls for taking the win and not going in on the ground, because a ground war could be dangerous for Israeli soldiers. It could get Israelis bogged down, and there'll be a political debate there about whether Israel really needs some type of new security zone in the south. Plenty of people are kind of saying, we saw that movie, it didn't go so well, don't go there again. But there is a real feeling in Israel that they have to do whatever it is they have to do to not reassert deterrence, but to actually degrade the threat and enable people to go back to their lives after, it's almost a year from the south and the north. These are not easy decisions, and we should not take lightly at all the consequence for civilians in Gaza, the consequence for civilians in Lebanon, and of course, the consequence for civilians in Israel too. War is horrible, and I blame Hamas and Hezbollah for starting one on October 7th and 8th.
Well, it sounds like you need to write a new chapter for your book.
Wow, a week after the last new chapter came out, but you're not wrong.
Thank you so much, Matt. Really appreciate you joining us.
It's really such a pleasure to be here. I really look forward to doing another AJC podcast on a much more uplifting topic sometime in the near future. But until then, let's hope that the region becomes more secure and that the ground is laid for us to have that kind of calmer conversation in the near future.
Thank you for listening. This episode is brought to you by AJC. Our producer is Atara Lakritz. Our sound engineer is TK Broderick. You can subscribe to People of the Pod on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or Google Podcasts, or learn more at ajc.org/peopleofthepod. The views and opinions of our guests don't necessarily reflect the positions of AJC. We'd love to hear your views and opinions or your questions. You can reach us at peopleofthepod@ajc.org. If you've enjoyed this episode, please be sure to tell your friends, tag us on social media with #PeopleOfThePod, and hop on to Apple Podcasts to rate us and write a review to help more listeners find us. Tune in next week for another episode of People of the Pod.